December 16th, 1944. 5:30 a.m. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Oberst Otto Skorzeny stood in the pre-dawn darkness, watching American positions through his binoculars as artificial moonlight from German searchlights bounced off low clouds, illuminating the snow-covered landscape. The legendary SS Commando, fresh from his triumph rescuing Mussolini, had been handpicked by Hitler to lead Operation Greif, a deception campaign using English-speaking Germans in American uniforms. Skorzeny smiled as he observed the American lines. The intelligence reports had been clear. The troops facing them were either green replacements from the 106th Infantry Division, in combat for less than a week, or exhausted veterans from the 28th Infantry Division, decimated in the Hürtgen forest and sent to this quiet sector to rest. Either way, they were exactly what German High Command expected from American soldiers: undisciplined, poorly trained, reliant on firepower and material superiority rather than tactical skill or fighting spirit. In 90 minutes, 3 German armies comprising 30 divisions and over 10,000 men would slam into a 75-mile stretch of American lines, held by just 5 divisions. The largest German offensive on the Western Front since 1940 would shatter what Wehrmacht officers dismissively called the Army defence, sweep to the Meuse River, capture Antwerp and split the Allied armies. The Americans, German commanders assured each other, would break and run just as the French had in 1940. What Skorzeny and his fellow officers didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined, was that they were about to discover why American soldiers, for all their apparent lack of Prussian discipline, were the most dangerous opponents Germany had ever faced. The story of the Battle of the Bulge is not just about a desperate German gamble or eventual Allied victory. It's about the moment when German military professionals, steeped in centuries of European warfare tradition, learned that American-style warfare, chaotic and improvised as it appeared, was devastatingly effective precisely because of qualities the Germans mistook for weakness. The German perspective on American soldiers in late 1944 was shaped by doctrine, experience, and profound cultural misunderstanding. To Wehrmacht officers trained in the rigid Prussian military tradition, American forces appeared fundamentally unserious about warfare. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, chief of the Wehrmacht operations staff, had compiled extensive reports on American military characteristics throughout 1944. His assessment, shared with senior commanders planning the Ardennes offensive, was damning. American soldiers lack the ideological commitment and martial spirit essential for sustained combat. They are motivated primarily by material comfort and personal survival rather than duty and honour. Their officers are selected through democratic processes rather than aristocratic tradition, resulting in mediocre leadership. Their tactics rely on overwhelming firepower to compensate for poor training and weak discipline. When cut off from supplies or faced with determined resistance, American units invariably surrender or retreat. This wasn't mere propaganda. It was the genuine assessment of professional military men analysing their enemy through the lens of their own military culture. German officers observed American soldiers chewing gum on guard duty, wearing non-regulation clothing, calling officers by their first names, and questioning orders. In the German military system, such behaviour indicated a fundamental lack of military discipline. What they failed to understand was that American military effectiveness operated on completely different principles than European armies. The American military system, born from a nation that had never maintained large standing armies, emphasized individual initiative, adaptability, and decentralized decision-making. Soldiers were expected to think, to question, to solve problems rather than merely follow orders. This created forces that appeared disorganized and undisciplined by European standards, but possessed something far more valuable in modern warfare: the ability to adapt and continue fighting when plans collapsed and command structures broke down. The German plan for Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, was built on assumptions about American behavior that had been reinforced throughout 1944. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, the aging Prussian aristocrat commanding German forces in the West, expressed typical German confidence in a December staff meeting. The Americans have soft discipline. Their conscript soldiers lack the hardness necessary for winter warfare. When we break through their lines, their units will disintegrate. They will not stand and fight when surrounded. They will attempt to retreat, and we will destroy them piecemeal. Their reliance on roads and vehicles means that once we control the road network, they will be helpless. The plan called for 3 armies to punch through the Ardennes, with 6th SS Panzer Army in the north, 5th Panzer Army in the centre, and 7th Army protecting the southern flank. The spearheads would bypass strong points, race for the Meuse River crossings, and reach Antwerp within a week. American units caught in the assault would be encircled and forced to surrender, just as French and British forces had been in 1940. The German officers planning the offensive had studied American performance throughout 1944. In Normandy, they had seen American forces struggle against determined German resistance, taking heavy casualties in the hedgerows. In Operation Market Garden, they had witnessed the failure of Montgomery's ambitious plan, with American paratroopers unable to break through to Arnhem. In the Hurtgen Forest, they had watched American divisions batter themselves to pieces against German defences, losing 33,000 men for minimal gains. Every engagement seemed to confirm German assumptions. When Americans had overwhelming superiority in numbers and firepower, they advanced. When faced with determined resistance or tactical complexity, they stalled. When surprised or cut off, they retreated. The conclusion seemed obvious. American soldiers were not warriors in the European sense. They were civilians in uniform, effective only when backed by massive material superiority. Oberst Friedrich August Freiherr von der Heydte, a Fallschirmjäger officer tasked with leading a paratrooper drop behind American lines, expressed a view common among German officers: the Americans fight with machines, not with spirit. Take away their tanks, their artillery, their air support, and they become helpless. A German soldier with a rifle is worth 3 Americans. A German soldier with determination is worth 10. Our men have been retreating for months, but their fighting spirit remains unbroken. When we attack, the Americans will discover what German soldiers can do when they take the offensive. This assessment ignored critical evidence. In scattered engagements where American units had been surrounded or cut off, they had often fought ferociously. At Mortain, when German forces counterattacked in August, surrounded American units had held their positions for 6 days against overwhelming odds. At Aachen, American forces had taken Germany's first major city in brutal urban combat that demonstrated tactical sophistication and determination. But German commanders attributed these performances to specific circumstances or exceptional units, not to systemic American military capabilities. The cultural blindness went deeper than tactics. German officers, products of a militaristic society where service was a sacred duty, couldn't comprehend a military system where soldiers were citizens first and warriors second. They saw American informality as a lack of discipline rather than as evidence of a different kind of military cohesion. They interpreted American willingness to surrender when tactically hopeless as cowardice rather than as pragmatic calculation. They mistook American reliance on technology and firepower as weakness, rather than as a different approach to warfare that maximized effectiveness while minimizing casualties. The irony was profound. The Germans, who prided themselves on military professionalism and tactical excellence, were about to be defeated by amateurs who didn't know enough to recognize when they were beaten. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16th, the German artillery opened up, over 1,600 guns firing along a 75-mile front, the largest German bombardment on the Western Front since 1940. For 90 minutes, high explosive and incendiary shells crashed into American positions, catching units at breakfast in bed, or just beginning their morning routines. Lieutenant Hans Wertmann of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division watched the bombardment from his assault position. Through my binoculars, I could see the American positions erupting in flames. Their tents were burning. Men were running in panic. I thought, this will be easy. They are already broken. When the bombardment lifted and German infantry surged forward through the morning darkness, the Americans fell back, just as German doctrine predicted, just as every staff study had forecast. The Green Troops of the 106th Infantry Division, many of whom had arrived in theatre only days earlier, were overwhelmed. By nightfall on December 16th, 2 entire regiments of the 106th, over 8,000 men, were surrounded on the Schnee-Eifel Ridge. It appeared to be a catastrophic American defeat, confirmation of every German assumption about American military weakness. But something strange was happening in the chaos of the German breakthrough, something that didn't fit the expected pattern. The Americans were falling back, yes, but they weren't breaking. Small units, cut off from their commands and surrounded by German forces, weren't surrendering. They were fighting. At Lanzerath, a tiny Belgian village on the northern shoulder of the German attack, an intelligence and reconnaissance platoon of 18 men from the 99th Infantry Division faced the entire 1st SS Panzer Division, the spearhead of 6th SS Panzer Army. The German force included over 500 paratroopers from the elite 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, backed by tanks and assault guns. Obersturmbannführer Jochen Peiper, commanding the armoured spearhead, expected to brush aside what his scouts reported as a small American roadblock and begin his race to the Meuse. The 18 Americans, led by First Lieutenant Lyle Buch, occupied hastily prepared positions on a hillside overlooking the village. They had 3 machine guns, a few bazookas and their personal weapons. No anti-tank guns, no artillery support, no reinforcements. German doctrine said they should withdraw or surrender when faced with overwhelming force. American doctrine said the same thing. Lieutenant Buch's men stayed and fought. The battle that followed defied every German expectation. For 20 hours, 18 American soldiers held up an entire SS Panzer division. The Germans attacked repeatedly, sending waves of paratroopers up the hill in textbook assaults. The Americans poured fire into them with a precision and ferocity that shocked the German commanders. Lieutenant Werner Sternebeck of the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment survived the battle and was later captured. His interrogation report captured German bewilderment. We were told the Americans were soft, that they would break easily. We attacked that position 5 times. Each time their machine guns cut us down. They didn't fire wildly like panicked soldiers. They fired in short, controlled bursts, aiming for maximum effect. Their discipline was better than elite German units. We lost over 90 men trying to take that one position. 90 men against 18 Americans. This was not what we were told to expect. Peiper, one of Germany's most aggressive commanders, was forced to wait for nightfall and artillery support before finally overwhelming the American position. By then, the delay had disrupted the entire timetable for 6th SS Panzer Army's advance. The Germans, expecting to cover 50 miles in the first day, had moved less than 5 miles. When Peiper's men finally overran the American position and took the survivors prisoner, the German commander did something highly unusual. He congratulated his captives on their defence and ensured they received medical treatment. According to American survivors, Peiper told them, "You're brave soldiers, better than we were told to expect." But this delay meant Peiper lost crucial hours in his race to the Meuse. Similar scenes were playing out across the Ardennes. At Hosingsen, another small unit from the 99th Infantry Division held a critical road junction against repeated German attacks. At Krinkelt-Rocherath, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions conducted a fighting withdrawal that delayed German armour for 2 crucial days, inflicting devastating casualties on the 12th SS Panzer Division. These weren't elite units or special forces. They were ordinary American soldiers, many of them draftees with limited training, fighting with a determination and tactical skill that German commanders found incomprehensible. The pattern repeated across the battlefield. American units, when surrounded or cut off, didn't surrender. They formed all around defences and fought. When communication broke down, junior officers and NCOs took charge without waiting for orders. When supplies ran low, they improvised. When tank support was unavailable, infantry found ways to fight armour with bazookas and determination. This was the American military system working exactly as designed, though in ways invisible to German observers. The informality that Germans mistook for poor discipline was actually evidence of initiative and adaptability. The willingness to question orders translated into junior leaders who could make decisions when command structures broke down. The emphasis on individual soldier skills meant that when units were fragmented, they remained combat effective. Oberst Heinz Kokott, commanding the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, attacking toward Bastogne, reported to 5th Panzer Army headquarters on December 17th with growing frustration. The Americans are not behaving as expected. We have broken through their lines in multiple places, surrounded several positions, but they continue to fight. Small groups are holding road junctions and villages, slowing our advance. When we finally overwhelm them, they have inflicted casualties far out of proportion to their numbers. Our timetable is already 12 hours behind schedule. The most striking example of German miscalculation came at a small crossroads town that would become the most famous battle of the Ardennes campaign, Bastogne. The town of Bastogne sat at the convergence of 7 major roads, making it the key to the entire Ardennes road network. Whoever controlled, Bastogne controlled movement through the region. The German plan called for 5th Panzer Army to seize the town quickly before American reinforcements could arrive, then continue the drive west. When General Feldmarschall von Rundstedt studied the map on December 17th and saw that American forces were rushing the 101st Airborne Division to Bastogne, he was confident. The paratroopers, elite troops, were being sent into an impossible situation. They would arrive tired from a 100-mile road march, with minimal equipment, facing multiple German divisions. They would be surrounded and forced to surrender within days. It never occurred to von Rundstedt that sending elite troops into a hopeless situation was exactly the kind of move that characterized American military thinking. The Americans didn't calculate odds the way Germans did. They identified what needed to be done and did it, regardless of whether it was theoretically possible. The 101st Airborne Division, along with elements of the 10th Armoured Division and various support units, reached Bastogne just hours before German forces surrounded the town. By December 21st, over 18,000 American soldiers were completely encircled, cut off from supplies, reinforcements and support. German forces outnumbered them roughly 3-1. The weather prevented air supply or support. The defenders lacked adequate ammunition, medical supplies and winter clothing. By every conventional military calculation, their situation was hopeless. General Lieutenant Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, commanding the 7th Panzer Corps surrounding Bastogne, was confident enough to send a formal surrender demand on December 22nd. The German ultimatum, delivered by 2 officers under a flag of truce, laid out the military reality. To the USA commander of the encircled town of Bastogne, the fortune of war is changing. This time, the USA forces in and near Bastogne have been encircled by strong German armoured units. There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. That is the honourable surrender of the encircled town. The German commander. It was a perfectly reasonable offer by European military standards. The situation was militarily hopeless. The Americans had fought well but were overwhelmed. Honour would be satisfied by a formal surrender under such circumstances. Any European army would have seriously considered it. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne, read the ultimatum and gave a response that would become legendary. His initial reaction was simply nuts. When his staff officers pointed out that he needed to provide a formal written response, McAuliffe realised his expletive was actually perfect. The official American response delivered to the bemused German officers consisted of a single word: nuts. The German officers, confused by the American slang, asked for clarification. Did this mean affirmative or negative? The American officer, delivering the response, made it clear. It means go to hell. The German surrender demand had assumed that American commanders thought like German commanders, that they calculated military situations rationally and surrendered when the mathematics of warfare said they should. McAuliffe's response revealed a fundamental difference in military culture. American forces didn't surrender because the situation looked hopeless on paper. They kept fighting until they couldn't fight anymore. Luttwitz, learning of the American refusal, was genuinely puzzled. He told his staff that the Americans apparently didn't understand their situation, that they would surely surrender once they realized further resistance was futile. What he didn't understand was that futility was a calculation the Americans simply didn't make in the same way Germans did. The siege of Bastogne that followed demonstrated everything German officers had failed to understand about American soldiers. The defenders, far from collapsing, organised an aggressive defence that repeatedly disrupted German attacks. American artillery, despite limited ammunition, was used with devastating precision, coordinated by observers who called fire missions that broke up German assaults before they could develop. When German tanks attacked, American tank destroyers and bazooka teams hunted them in the streets, turning the town into a death trap for armour. Oberstleutnant Helmut Remmer, commanding German forces attacking Bastogne's western perimeter, reported on December 23rd. The Americans fight with a determination we did not expect. They counterattack constantly, even when surrounded and outnumbered. Their coordination between infantry, armour and artillery remains excellent despite being encircled. Most surprisingly, their morale appears high. They show no signs of the demoralisation we anticipated. The weather cleared on December 23rd, allowing American aircraft to drop supplies and attack German positions around Bastogne. But the siege wasn't broken by air supply. It was broken by something that showcased another aspect of American military capability that Germans had underestimated: operational flexibility. General George Patton's Third Army, fighting 70 miles south of Bastogne when the German offensive began, executed a 90-degree turn and drove north through appalling weather and difficult terrain to relieve the surrounded garrison. The operational movement involved shifting 9 divisions, over 133,000 men with all their vehicles, supplies and equipment, changing their axis of advance by 90 degrees, and attacking north in less than 72 hours. It was a feat of logistics, command and control that German officers considered impossible. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzerlehr Division blocking the southern approaches to Bastogne, watched Patton's forces approaching and reported to headquarters with something approaching awe. The Americans have accomplished something we were told they could not do. They have reoriented an entire army in less than 3 days, maintained supply lines through winter weather, and are attacking with full force. This is not the performance of an undisciplined or poorly organized military. This is professional-level staff work executed with resources we cannot match. When lead elements of Patton's 4th Armoured Division broke through to Bastogne on December 26th, ending the siege, the Germans finally began to understand. The problem wasn't that American soldiers were cowards or that American officers were incompetent. The problem was that American military effectiveness operated on principles completely different from German military doctrine. While Germans emphasized rigid planning, detailed orders, and hierarchical command structures, Americans emphasized mission-type orders, individual initiative, and adaptability. German forces were superbly effective when executing planned operations but struggled when plans broke down. American forces appeared chaotic during planned operations, but excelled when everything went wrong. In the Battle of the Bulge, everything went wrong constantly. That was when American military culture showed its true strength. The battle for the northern shoulder of the German attack, around Elsenborn Ridge, provided another stark example of how German assumptions about American behavior proved catastrophically wrong. Generaloberst Josef Sepp Dietrich, commanding 6th SS Panzer Army, had planned for his forces to break through the American lines in the first day, then race west. By December 19th, 3 days into the offensive, his entire army was still struggling to break through what was supposed to be a thin screen of green American troops. The 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions, supported by elements of other units, had conducted a fighting withdrawal to prepared positions on Elsenborn Ridge and stopped the German advance cold. The American defense shouldn't have worked according to German military theory. The units involved were a mix of green and experienced troops thrown together hastily, lacking unified command structures, forced to defend in weather and terrain that favoured the attacker. They should have been overwhelmed or forced to retreat. Instead, they held. Major Gunther Kienitz of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend kept a diary during the battle that captured German frustration. December 18th, attacked American positions at Krinkelt. Expected quick breakthrough. Americans fought from every building, every basement. When we took one house, they counterattacked from another. Lost 4 Panthers to American bazookas in street fighting. December 19th, renewed attack. Americans have retreated to ridge positions. Our artillery pounds them for hours. When we attack, they emerge from their holes and fight. How do they survive such bombardment? December 20th, cannot break through American lines. Our casualties are enormous. The Americans defend with a stubbornness that exceeds anything we faced in Russia. Where is the soft American soldier we were told about? The answer to Kienitz's question lay in understanding what the Germans had mistaken for softness. American soldiers complained about conditions, questioned decisions, and maintained an informality that shocked European observers. But when fighting started, that same cultural flexibility translated into extraordinary tactical effectiveness. Private First Class Richard McKee of the 2nd Infantry Division, defending Elsenborn Ridge, later described the battle in terms that would have been incomprehensible to German officers. Nobody was giving detailed orders. The Germans were coming and we had to stop them. Our sergeant said hold this position, so we did. When our machine gun jammed, I fixed it. When we ran low on ammunition, we collected it from casualties. When the guy next to me was hit, another guy took his position. We didn't need someone to tell us what to do every second. We could see what needed doing. The German attacks on Elsenborn Ridge continued for days, throwing elite SS Panzer divisions against American defensive positions in brutal frontal assaults. The result was a slaughter that shocked German commanders. The Americans, fighting from prepared positions with excellent fields of fire, cut down German attackers in windrows. When Germans' tanks appeared, American tank destroyers and artillery destroyed them. When the Germans tried to flank, American units shifted positions and blocked them. By December 22nd, Dietrich reported to Hitler that 6th SS Panzer Army was stalled, unable to break through American defences despite overwhelming local superiority. The northern shoulder of the German attack had been held by troops the Germans considered inferior. The battle for St. Vith provided perhaps the most telling example of German miscalculation. The town, another critical road junction, was defended by elements of the 7th Armoured Division and remnants of the shattered 106th Infantry Division. The force was outnumbered, surrounded, and according to German calculations should have surrendered by December 20th at the latest. Instead, the Americans held St. Vith until December 23rd, tying up 2 German corps and completely disrupting the timetable for 5th Panzer Army's advance. When the Americans finally withdrew, they did so in good order, taking their equipment and wounded, rejoining American lines to the west. General Major Robert Hasbrouck, commanding the American forces at St. Vith, operated with minimal communication with higher headquarters, made his own decisions about when to attack, when to defend, and when to withdraw, and coordinated multiple units from different divisions without unified command structure. It was exactly the kind of military chaos that German doctrine said should result in defeat. Instead, it resulted in a battle that bought crucial time for American forces to reorganize. Oberstgruppenführer Felix Steiner, analyzing the St. Vith, battle after the war, admitted German blindness. We expected American forces to be paralyzed by encirclement, to wait for orders from higher headquarters, to surrender when the tactical situation became untenable. Instead, their local commanders made independent decisions, often very good decisions, without waiting for instructions. Their junior officers and even enlisted men showed initiative we associated only with highly trained German troops. We were fighting an enemy we did not understand. The weather cleared on December 23rd and American air power entered the battle in force. Thousands of sorties by fighters, bombers and transport aircraft struck German columns, destroyed supplies, and isolated German spearheads. German officers had known American air superiority would be a factor eventually, but they had gambled that poor winter weather would keep Allied aircraft grounded long enough for German forces to reach their objectives. What shocked them was how quickly and effectively American air power was integrated into ground operations. Oberst Meinrad von Lauchert, commanding the 2nd Panzer Division that came closest to reaching the Meuse River, watched American aircraft destroy his division in a matter of hours. On December 24th, we were within sight of the Meuse. Our fuel was low, but we were close to our objective. Then the American aircraft came, wave after wave, fighter bombers destroying every vehicle that moved, medium bombers hitting our assembly areas. Even our artillery couldn't fire without being attacked from the air. By nightfall, my division was combat ineffective. The Americans had accomplished in hours what German ground forces couldn't do in days. The coordination between American ground and air forces reflected years of investment in communications, training, and doctrine. Forward air controllers with ground units could call in airstrikes within minutes. Pilots understood ground tactics and worked directly with ground commanders. The system wasn't perfect. Friendly fire incidents occurred, but its overall effectiveness was devastating. German forces, by contrast, had essentially no air support and limited anti-aircraft capabilities. By Christmas Day, the German offensive had clearly failed. The deepest penetrations by the 2nd Panzer Division reached within 4 miles of the Meuse River before being surrounded and destroyed. Piper's Kampfgruppe, the spearhead of 6th SS Panzer Army, abandoned its vehicles and retreated on foot after being cut off near Stoumont. Every German objective, Antwerp, the Meuse bridges, even local goals like Bastogne remained in American hands. More importantly, the German army had been bled white. The offensive cost Germany over 100,000 casualties, including 12,652 killed. More than 600 tanks and assault guns were destroyed, losses that could never be replaced. Hundreds of experienced officers and NCOs were dead, men whose tactical skill and leadership were irreplaceable. The Luftwaffe, committed its remaining resources to support the offensive and lost over 600 aircraft. Germany's last operational reserves were expended in an offensive that gained nothing. The American forces lost heavily too, over 19,000 killed and 47,500 wounded. But the Americans could replace those losses. Ships were arriving daily with fresh divisions, new equipment and mountains of supplies. American factories were producing tanks faster than they could be shipped overseas. The disparity in resources which Germans had always known existed was now coupled with a disparity in combat effectiveness. The Americans weren't just richer, they were better. In January 1945, as American forces counterattacked to eliminate the bulge and drive German forces back to their starting positions, German officers began to fully understand what they had missed. General Lieutenant Otto Remer, who had led forces in the attack on Bastogne, was captured in March 1945. His interrogation by American intelligence included extended discussions about German perceptions of American military capabilities. The transcript is revealing. Interrogator: before the Ardennes offensive, what was your assessment of American combat capability? Remer: we believed the Americans were soft soldiers, good equipment, much firepower, but lacking the hardness and discipline for sustained combat. We thought if we hit them hard, broke through their lines, they would collapse. Interrogator: and after the battle? Remer: we were wrong, completely wrong. The Americans fought with unexpected determination. More importantly, they fought intelligently. When our tactics succeeded, they adapted new tactics. When we surrounded them, they held position instead of surrendering. When their plans failed, they improvised. This was not the behavior of soft or poorly trained soldiers. Interrogator: what surprised you most? Remer: the initiative of their junior officers and enlisted men. In the German army, if you cut off a unit from higher command, its effectiveness drops dramatically. Men wait for orders, for someone to tell them what to do. American soldiers, when cut off, continued to fight effectively. Sergeants and even privates made tactical decisions we would expect only from officers. This independence, which we mistook for poor discipline, made them very difficult to defeat. The Ardennes offensive represented the last time German officers would underestimate American military capabilities. In the final 4 months of the war, as American forces drove into Germany, German respect for American combat effectiveness grew with each battle. The crossing of the Rhine, the reduction of the Ruhr pocket, the final drives into central Germany, all demonstrated American military competence that German officers had once dismissed. General Major Gerhard Graf von Schwerin, who commanded troops against Americans from Normandy to Germany's surrender, reflected in a 1946 interview on the evolution of German perceptions. In 1944, we believed Americans were good fighters only when they had overwhelming superiority. By 1945, we knew better. We had seen them adapt to every tactical situation, overcome every obstacle we placed before them, and maintain offensive pressure regardless of casualties or setbacks. The question was no longer whether Americans could fight well. The question was whether anything could stop them. What German officers finally understood too late was that American military effectiveness wasn't despite American cultural characteristics, it was because of them. A society that valued individual initiative produced soldiers who could think for themselves. A culture that questioned authority produced officers who could adapt when orders became obsolete. An economy built on mass production and logistics produced an army that treated supply chains as weapons. The very characteristics that made American soldiers appear undisciplined by Prussian standards, the informality, the questioning of orders, the emphasis on individual rather than collective identity, were precisely what made American forces so effective in the chaos of modern warfare. General der Panzertruppen Hermann Balck, considered one of Germany's finest operational commanders, analysed American military capability in his post-war memoirs. The Americans created a military system perfectly suited to their national character and industrial base. They did not try to produce German-style soldiers through harsh discipline and ideological indoctrination. Instead, they trained men to use initiative, to work together voluntarily rather than through rigid hierarchy, and to employ overwhelming firepower and material resources. German officers, myself included, mistook this for military weakness. We thought discipline meant blind obedience, that martial spirit required ideological fanaticism, that good soldiers needed harsh treatment. The Americans proved us wrong. Their soldiers, fighting for a cause they believed in, led by officers they respected rather than feared, supported by unmatched industrial power, were more effective than our supposedly superior forces. The Ardennes offensive was Germany's last chance to change the course of the war in the West. It failed not because of weather, or supplies, or specific tactical failures, though all those played roles. It failed because German commanders built their plan on false assumptions about their enemy. They attacked an army they didn't understand, making calculations based on outdated ideas about military effectiveness. The American soldiers who held at Bastogne, who delayed German spearheads at dozens of small towns and crossroads, who adapted to chaos and kept fighting when surrounded and outgunned, those soldiers weren't undisciplined, they were differently disciplined. They had internalized a way of warfare that didn't require rigid orders from above because they understood the mission and were empowered to accomplish it using their own judgment. In the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes, American GIs demonstrated that you didn't need Prussian discipline to be effective soldiers. You needed initiative, adaptability, and determination. You needed the confidence to make decisions when communications broke down and plans fell apart. You needed the kind of military culture that trusted sergeants and privates to do the right thing without detailed orders. By late January 1945, as the Battle of the Bulge officially ended, with German forces pushed back to their starting positions, the Wehrmacht had learned its lesson. American soldiers weren't undisciplined. They simply had a different kind of discipline, one that proved more effective in the crucible of modern warfare. Oberst Otto Skorzeny, whose Operation Greif deception mission had failed completely when American forces proved far more alert and capable than expected, reflected on the German defeat in his post-war writings. We thought we were the professionals and they were the amateurs. We thought our tactical skill and fighting spirit would overcome their material superiority. The Ardennes proved we were wrong. The Americans were professionals too, just a different kind of professional. They didn't win through blind obedience or fanatic determination. They won through intelligence, flexibility, and an industrial system that could produce not just equipment, but competent soldiers faster than we could kill them. The ultimate irony of the Battle of the Bulge is that German commanders learned their lesson perfectly, but far too late to matter. By the time they understood what made American forces effective, Germany had exhausted its resources in failed attacks based on false assumptions. The war would end 4 months later with American forces deep inside Germany, their supposedly undisciplined soldiers having outfought the Wehrmacht across Western Europe. In the decades after the war, historians and military analysts studied the Battle of the Bulge extensively. The tactical details, the operational decisions, the strategic calculations all have been examined minutely, but perhaps the most important lesson is the simplest. Never mistake a different military culture for an inferior one. The German officers who planned the Ardennes offensive were products of Europe's most prestigious military tradition, trained in tactics perfected over centuries, leading men who had conquered most of Europe. They made one critical error. They assumed their way of warfare was the only effective way, that their standards of discipline and tactical excellence were universal measures of military capability. The American soldiers who stopped them, ordinary men from a nation with no military tradition, proved that assumption fatally wrong. At the American military cemetery at Henri-Chapelle in Belgium, rows of white crosses mark the graves of American soldiers who died in the Battle of the Bulge. Many were from the units Germans expected to break and run. The 106th Infantry Division, the 28th Infantry Division, the 99th Infantry Division. Green troops and exhausted veterans who held the line when German commanders were certain they would collapse. On the German side, thousands of soldiers who died in the Ardennes lie in military cemeteries across Belgium and Luxembourg. Many believed until the end that they were the better soldiers. The German tactical excellence and martial spirit should have defeated American material superiority. They died learning otherwise. The Battle of the Bulge didn't just defeat a German offensive, it shattered German illusions about warfare itself. The rigid, hierarchical, ideologically driven military system that had conquered most of Europe couldn't defeat an army that emphasized initiative, adaptability, and individual responsibility. The supposedly undisciplined Americans turned out to be disciplined in ways that mattered more in modern warfare. When Oberst Skorzeny stood in the pre-dawn darkness of December 16th, watching American positions through his binoculars, he expected to see soft, undisciplined troops who would break under pressure. What he got instead was a battle that would cost Germany the war and teach Wehrmacht officers that their assumptions about military effectiveness were as outdated as their strategic position. The Americans didn't fight the way Germans expected. They didn't surrender when surrounded. They didn't collapse when plans failed. They didn't require detailed orders to continue fighting. They did exactly what their system trained them to do. They adapted, they improvised, they fought with whatever they had, and they won. German officers thought American soldiers were undisciplined. By the end of the Ardennes campaign, they knew better. The Americans had a different discipline, one that couldn't be seen in parade ground formations or measured by the stiffness of a salute. It was the discipline of men who understood why they were fighting, and possessed the judgment to determine how best to accomplish their mission. The broader implications of German miscalculation in the Ardennes extended far beyond that single battle. The offensive consumed Germany's last strategic reserves, over 250,000 of its best remaining troops, at a time when those forces were desperately needed to defend against Soviet offensives in the east. Hitler had gambled everything on the assumption that American forces would break, that a dramatic victory in the West would shatter the Allied coalition and allow Germany to negotiate a separate peace. The gamble was based on fantasy. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, no admirer of American military methods, observed in early 1945 that the Germans had made a fundamental error in judgment. The Americans fight in a way that appears unmilitary to European eyes. They lack our parade ground precision, our formal discipline, our rigid command structures. But they possess something more valuable in actual combat: the ability to continue fighting effectively when everything has gone wrong. The Germans discovered this too late to matter. The statistics of the Ardennes campaign told a story that German pre-battle assessments had declared impossible. American forces, despite being surprised and initially outnumbered nearly 4-1, had contained the German offensive within days. The deepest German penetration, roughly 65 miles, was achieved in the first week. After that, despite continued fighting, German forces made no significant gains. American casualties were severe, 9,500 total casualties, including 19,000 dead. But these losses, devastating as they were to the men who suffered them and the families who mourned them, were replaced within weeks. Fresh divisions arrived from the United States. Replacements filled out depleted units. New equipment rolled off transport ships. The American military machine absorbed the losses and continued operation without pause. German losses were irreplaceable. Beyond the 100,000 casualties and destroyed equipment, the Ardennes consumed Germany's fuel reserves, ammunition stockpiles, and most critically, experienced leaders. A panzer commander with 5 years of combat experience who died in Belgium couldn't be replaced by a lieutenant with 3 months of training. A veteran sergeant who knew how to keep his men alive through their first battles couldn't be replaced by a teenager drafted in desperation. Generaloberst Heinz Guderian, chief of the German General Staff, had opposed the Ardennes offensive from the beginning, arguing that the reserves should be used to defend against the coming Soviet winter offensive. After the battle, he reflected bitterly on the cost. We threw away our last mobile reserves in a gamble based on wishful thinking about American capabilities. The troops lost in the Ardennes, the tanks destroyed, the fuel consumed, all were desperately needed in the East. Hitler's fantasy about American military weakness cost us any chance of prolonged defense. The Soviet offensive that struck in January 1945, just as the Ardennes battle was ending, confirmed Guderian's fears. German forces in the East, weakened by the transfer of units to the West and deprived of the reserves lost in Belgium, collapsed under massive Soviet attacks. By February, Soviet forces had advanced over 300 miles and stood less than 40 miles from Berlin. In the West, American forces resumed their offensive in late January. The units that had fought in the Ardennes, units German commanders had expected to be shattered and demoralized, attacked with vigor. The 101st Airborne Division, which had endured a week-long siege at Bastogne, was back in full offensive operations within 2 weeks of being relieved. The 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions, which had held Elsenborn Ridge against elite SS Panzer divisions, attacked into Germany in February. This rapid recovery shocked German intelligence officers analysing American capabilities. Oberst Friedrich August von der Heyte, in Allied captivity by March 1945, discussed German surprise at American resilience. We inflicted what we believed were crippling casualties on American units in the Ardennes. We expected those divisions to require months to recover, to be pulled from the line for rest and refitting. Instead, they were attacking again within weeks. This demonstrated not just material superiority, but organizational capability we had not credited the Americans with possessing. The organizational capability von der Heydte referenced was another aspect of American military effectiveness that Germans had underestimated. The US Army's replacement system, training pipeline, and logistical organization could sustain combat operations indefinitely. Individual replacements, not entire units, filled casualties. Damaged equipment was repaired or replaced within days. Supply lines functioned with mechanical efficiency even under combat conditions. German forces, by contrast, operated on a system that was breaking down by late 1944. Units fought until they were destroyed, then were withdrawn and rebuilt from scratch, a process that took months. Equipment losses often couldn't be replaced at all due to production shortfalls and transportation difficulties. Supply lines, hammered by Allied air power and partisan attacks, functioned intermittently at best. Captain Heinz Schmidt of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division kept a diary that captured German frustration with the disparity. December 27, 1944. Our battalion is at 40% strength. We have been told no replacements are available. Ammunition is rationed. Fuel is nearly exhausted. Food is short. Across the valley we can see American supply trucks moving constantly. Their artillery fires without pause. We hear their tanks moving at night. They seem to have unlimited everything while we have nothing. How do you fight an enemy with infinite resources? The question haunted German forces in the final months of the war, but the Ardennes had taught them that American advantages went beyond mere resources. Even when cut off from supply, American units fought effectively. Even when outnumbered, they held positions or conducted organized withdrawals. Even when surprised and scattered, they regrouped and counterattacked. The tactical lessons German officers derived from the Ardennes appeared in intelligence summaries and training bulletins issued in early 1945. These documents, captured by Allied forces, revealed how completely German perceptions had shifted. One bulletin from Army Group B headquarters, dated January 30, 1945, included this assessment of American combat capabilities. American forces have demonstrated tactical flexibility and combat determination equal to or exceeding German forces. Previous assessments suggesting American military weakness were based on fundamental misunderstanding of American military doctrine. American soldiers show high initiative at all levels. Junior officers and NCOs operate independently and effectively when communications are disrupted. Enlisted men show willingness to fight when surrounded or in difficult tactical situations. The combination of superior material resources, adequate to excellent training, and tactical flexibility makes American forces extremely dangerous opponents. Defensive operations should assume American attacks will be persistent and well coordinated. Offensive operations should not assume American forces will retreat or surrender when tactically disadvantaged. This was remarkable admission from an army that had spent years propagandizing about Allied military inferiority. But the transformation in German military assessment wasn't driven by propaganda concerns. It was driven by survival. Officers and soldiers who continued to underestimate American capabilities died. Those who survived learned to respect their enemy. Lieutenant Fritz Langanke of the 2nd Panzer Division, who fought against American forces from the Ardennes through the final surrender, recalled the shift in perspective. In December 1944, we still believed we were better soldiers than the Americans. We had more experience, better training, superior tactical doctrine. We thought if we could just hit them hard enough, they would break. By February 1945, we knew better. The Americans were not inferior soldiers. They were different soldiers, but just as effective and often more so because they had resources we lacked. The respect was mutual, though Americans tended to frame it differently. American soldiers who fought in the Ardennes developed appreciation for German tactical skill and fighting determination, but they never doubted the outcome. Private Paul Fussell, who fought in the Battle of the Bulge and later became a distinguished literary scholar, wrote about the experience decades later. We knew the Germans were good soldiers. They proved it every day, but we also knew we were going to win because we had everything we needed and they had nothing. More than that, we knew how to fight the kind of war that was actually happening, not the kind of war that military academies taught. When things went wrong, and they always went wrong, we figured out what to do next. That wasn't lack of discipline. That was a different kind of discipline. The broader strategic situation after the Ardennes left Germany in an impossible position. In the east, Soviet forces were advancing rapidly toward Berlin. In the west, American, British and Canadian forces were preparing to cross the Rhine and drive into Germany's industrial heartland. Germany's military was exhausted, its fuel reserves depleted, its air force destroyed, its production capacity crippled by Allied bombing. Yet German forces continued to fight with a determination that surprised even themselves. The mythology of superior German military prowess had been shattered, but individual German soldiers and units continued to resist, often effectively, until the final surrender. This wasn't the ideological fanaticism that Allied propaganda suggested, though that played a role. It was the professionalism of soldiers doing their duty under impossible circumstances. General Major Gerhard Engels, Chief of Staff of Army Group B, analysed German military performance in the war's final months in his post-war memoirs. After the Ardennes, we knew we couldn't win. The question became how to minimise further losses while continuing to resist. Our soldiers fought well, often brilliantly in tactical terms, but strategic victory was impossible. The Americans and their allies simply had too much of everything, and their soldiers were better than we had believed. The crossing of the Rhine in March 1945 demonstrated how far German assessment of American capabilities had evolved. When American forces seized the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen on March 7th, creating the first Allied bridgehead across the Rhine, German response was immediate and desperate. Hitler ordered the bridge destroyed regardless of cost. German forces threw everything available into attacks meant to eliminate the bridgehead. The Americans expanded the bridgehead methodically, fighting off German counterattacks while engineers constructed additional bridges. Within a week, 5 divisions were across the Rhine. Within 2 weeks, the bridgehead was 20 miles wide and 10 miles deep. German forces couldn't compress it, couldn't contain it, couldn't eliminate it, despite committing their last reserves to the effort. General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring, who had replaced von Rundstedt as commander in the West after the Ardennes failure, reported to Hitler with brutal honesty. The Americans have established an unbreakable position across the Rhine. Our counterattacks are ineffective. Their defensive positions are well prepared and heavily supported by artillery and air power. Their forces expand the bridgehead faster than we can contain it. We lack the resources to eliminate it. Recommend we withdraw to more defensible positions to preserve remaining forces. Hitler's response was to order continued attacks regardless of losses. But German commanders on the ground were making their own calculations. The Americans they faced in March 1945 were not the same troops they had attacked in December. These were veteran soldiers who had survived the Ardennes, who had learned their own lessons about German tactics and capabilities, who fought with the confidence that came from winning. The breakout from the Remagen bridgehead in late March became a rout. American armoured divisions, supported by overwhelming air power and artillery, sliced through German defences that had no depth, no reserves, and no hope of stopping them. The encirclement of the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, trapped over 300,000 German troops in a pocket that was systematically reduced over 3 weeks. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding the trapped forces in the Ruhr pocket, faced a choice that perfectly illustrated how German military culture differed from American. By all military logic, his situation was hopeless. His forces were surrounded, cut off from supply, facing an enemy with overwhelming superiority in every category. European military tradition offered 2 options: breakout or surrender. Model chose neither. He ordered his forces to continue fighting, holding cities and towns to delay American advances, but also gave permission for individual units to surrender when their tactical situations became untenable. He disbanded his headquarters on April 15th, telling his staff that a field marshal does not become a prisoner. On April 21st, Model walked into a forest near Duisburg and shot himself. His decision reflected a military culture that valued honour and duty above pragmatic calculation, that saw surrender as personal disgrace even when tactically rational. It was the same culture that had led German commanders to dismiss American military effectiveness based on superficial observations about discipline and bearing. American commanders, by contrast, operated in a military culture that valued effectiveness over appearances, that accepted surrender when resistance became futile, that treated warfare as a problem to be solved rather than a test of character. When American units were surrounded or cut off, they fought until the situation was genuinely hopeless, then surrendered without considering it a personal failing. The different approaches to military honour reflected different national characters and historical experiences. Germany's military tradition stretched back centuries, intertwined with national identity and social hierarchies. America's military tradition was pragmatic and democratic, viewing warfare as an unfortunate necessity rather than a noble calling. Neither approach was inherently superior in moral terms, but in the context of World War II, the American approach proved more effective. Soldiers who valued survival and victory over abstract concepts of military honour made better decisions in chaotic combat situations. Officers who accepted responsibility for their decisions rather than blindly following orders adapted more successfully to changing circumstances. By late April 1945, organised German resistance in the West had effectively ended. American forces were approaching the Elbe River, the agreed line of demarcation with Soviet forces advancing from the east. The war would continue for another 2 weeks, but the outcome had long since been decided. In the final days, as German forces surrendered by the hundreds of thousands, interrogations of German officers revealed the complete transformation in their assessment of American military capabilities. Major Hans von Luck, a panzer officer who fought against Americans from Normandy to Germany's surrender, was asked by his interrogators about his final assessment of American soldiers. In 1944, we thought they were soft, undisciplined, reliant on material superiority. By 1945, we knew they were tough, flexible, and more effective than we were in the kind of warfare that actually mattered. They didn't need our kind of discipline because they had internalized their mission. They didn't need rigid orders because they understood their objectives. They didn't need ideological motivation because they were fighting for something they believed in. We lost not because they had more resources, though they did, but because their military system was better suited to modern warfare than ours. The strategic lessons of the Ardennes and subsequent campaigns influenced American military doctrine for decades. The emphasis on individual initiative, decentralized decision-making, and mission-type orders became enshrined in US Army doctrine. The recognition that apparent indiscipline could mask effective military flexibility influenced everything from basic training to officer education. For Germany, the lessons were harder to absorb. The military tradition that had produced such effective tactical and operational performance in the early war years had proven unable to adapt to changed circumstances. The assumption that rigid discipline and hierarchical command structures were essential for military effectiveness had been disproven at devastating cost. Former Luftwaffe officer Johannes Steinhoff, reflecting on German military culture after the war, identified the fundamental problem. We had the better tactics, the more experienced officers, the superior military tradition. But we were trapped by that tradition. We couldn't adapt when our assumptions proved wrong, because adapting would have meant abandoning everything we believed about military excellence. The Americans had no such constraints. They could adapt because they had no rigid doctrine to defend. The Battle of the Bulge stands as the moment when German illusions about American military weakness died forever. In the snow and forests of the Ardennes, American soldiers demonstrated that discipline came in many forms, that tactical excellence could emerge from flexibility rather than rigidity, that a democratic society could produce warriors as effective as any aristocratic military caste. The young American soldiers who held at Bastogne, who delayed German spearheads at countless crossroads, who adapted and improvised and kept fighting when every tactical calculation said they should surrender, those men weren't undisciplined. They were warriors of a different type, products of a different military culture, effective for reasons German military tradition couldn't recognize. When Oberst Otto Skorzeny watched American positions through his binoculars on the morning of December 16, 1944, he saw what he expected to see: soft, undisciplined soldiers who would break under pressure. What he couldn't see, what no amount of German military professionalism could detect, was the quality that made American soldiers so dangerous. The ability to think, to adapt, to keep fighting when all the rules said they should quit. By May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered unconditionally, that lesson had been taught thoroughly. The Wehrmacht, once considered the finest military force in the world, had been defeated by enemies it had underestimated. The Americans, who German officers had dismissed as undisciplined amateurs, had fought their way from Normandy to the Elbe, overcoming every obstacle and defeating every defence. The final irony was that German officers ended the war with genuine respect for American military capability, while Americans never quite understood how deeply they had been underestimated. For Americans, the progression from Normandy to victory seemed natural, the inevitable result of courage, resources, and determination. They didn't realise that in German calculations they weren't supposed to win at all. The Battle of the Bulge was where illusion met reality, where centuries of German military tradition confronted a new kind of warfare, where assumptions about discipline and effectiveness were tested in combat and found completely wrong. The Americans won not despite their apparent lack of traditional military virtues, but because those virtues weren't what modern warfare required. In the end, the question wasn't whether American soldiers were disciplined enough to be effective. The question was whether German officers were flexible enough to recognise that discipline came in forms their military tradition didn't comprehend. The answer, delivered at terrible cost across the frozen fields of Belgium, was no. The thunder of American artillery, the rumble of American tanks, the roar of American aircraft, all had become the sounds of German defeat. But perhaps the most devastating sound was quieter. The sound of American sergeants and privates making tactical decisions, adapting to chaos, continuing to fight when German doctrine said they should be paralysed. That was the sound of a different kind of military excellence, one that German officers never learned to hear until it was far too late to matter.